Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Kelsey Sheehy. I'm an education reporter at U.S. News and World Report. And today we're doing a live Google Hangout on air, Student Loan Repayment 101. And so for many students who graduated in May, your 6-month grace period on your student loans is expiring or has expired. And kicking off those student loan repayments on the right foot is really essential, but also keeping up with those student loans down the road is too. Doing so can be difficult, complicated, especially when you're managing your finances. So we have 3 great experts on hand here to answer questions live from our audience about student loan repayment. Joining us today we have Betsy Mayotte, with American Student Assistance. We also have Carrie Sloan, who is with LearnVest, a personal finance website and great resource. And then also Kathy Rosa, who is with the Financial Aid Office at Boston College. So thank you to all 3 of you for joining our panel. And anyone who is watching live, please feel free to ask any questions using our Q&A app. We've also been soliciting questions from our readers for the last week and a half, so I'm not going to waste any time. I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into the questions, and hopefully we can get some good feedback from our viewers today as well. So one of the first questions that we got from our audience about student loan repayment comes from Antoinette Matthews, and Antoinette asked this via Facebook. She said, I'm unemployed and I'm getting letters saying I'm not going about repaying the right way. What am I to do? Kathy, I imagine this is a position that a lot of students are in right after graduation. So what should Antoinette and these students do if they're unemployed and they're getting these letters about repaying their loans?
The first thing I would suggest is certainly not to do nothing. First of all, take action. Contact your student loan servicing company immediately when you don't have a job and you cannot make a payment under any circumstance, even if that's not just unemployment, underemployment as well, or other tragedy that might have befallen you. So definitely contact your servicing company, ask for a forbearance or a deferment, and they will guide you to the proper paperwork, and that will protect your credit. It will not expect you to make a payment, although it will accrue interest on your Stafford loans while you're in this particular forbearance or deferment.
Thanks, Kathy. I think that that's really great advice, especially don't do anything. It can be really scary when you're getting those loans and know you can't pay the bill, but the worst thing that students can do really is to ignore those notices. Betsy or Carrie, do either of you have anything to add to that or any additional advice for students who might find themselves in that situation?
I just want to reemphasize that absolutely make the phone call. If there's always something that the student loan servicer can do to try to help.
Great.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I think people make the mistake of not looking at their finances in general, so know what you owe, know what your situation is, know what your grace period is, and know when you need to act, because running from it isn't going to make those loans go away, as scary as they might be.
Absolutely. All 3 of you made some really good points. Those loans aren't going to go anywhere unless you deal with them. So speaking of dealing with them, one of the questions that we received this question from Holly Manson via our Facebook account. And Holly said, how do you go about consolidating loans to make the monthly payments more affordable? She says she wants to be able to repay her loans, but she can't afford it with her current job. And so can one of you kind of speak a little bit to consolidating those loans? Do either one of you prefer to take that question?
I can take it if you wish. Doesn't matter.
Okay, Kathy.
Consolidation is actually pretty simple. I would recommend that they consolidate with the federal government for federal loans. That's the best source and the safest source, of course. So it's directloanconsolidation.ed.gov. It's an online process, and most students are pretty savvy when it comes to online processes and computers. It will ask you what loans do you wish to put into the consolidation and which loans do you wish to exempt from the consolidation, and you do have a choice as a student borrower whether to exempt some loans, and that's something that should be considered. It will combine all of the debt under one servicing company if you have many servicing companies or multiple, and it will allow you to extend your debt longer than the traditional 10 years as these loans were designed to be paid back in. So by stretching the debt, it can decrease your monthly installment and make it sort of more affordable or more palatable, certainly, during the repayment period. Extending the debt, however, does extend the amount of money that the loan is going to cost you in the long run. So just as a caution, it will cost you more when you consolidate debt and stretch it out longer than the traditional 10 years. But it is definitely a methodology to help manage debt and manage the monthly installment and make it much more affordable for students.
That's really a really good point that you bring up, is that it can extend the debt, but it can also wind up students will be paying more money potentially in the long run. You know, Carrie, I'd like to pose this to you as, you know, from the personal finance side. What should students weigh if they're looking at consolidating their loans, maybe stretching out that lending term, but paying more overall?
There are a few things that you have to consider. The one thing that I wanted to add to that is that by consolidating, you can potentially see a reduction in the rate that you're paying, which is an advantage. I think the other thing you want to look at are creative ways to pay. We know that the majority of borrowers fall into the standard repayment plan of 10 years. There are at least 6 other ways to pay back your loans. There's an income-based payment plan that a lot of people should look into. The government is actually looking to promote that. It may not be the best for everybody. But I think the other point is, once you have student loans and you're a new graduate, you say, oh my goodness, I'm looking for a job, I have these looming over my head. Don't ignore your whole financial picture. Student loans are what we call good debt. They're actually less toxic than credit card debt. So what you want to do is weigh the other debt and also consider saving up an emergency savings cushion in case you don't find a job, your car breaks down. You absolutely do not want your loans to go into deferral. So what you want to do is to balance your different priorities. The other thing that the financial planners at LearnVest always recommend is that you don't want to forego saving for retirement, even if you're trying to pay down student loans. And I know when you're first getting those paychecks, it may seem like an impossibility. One of our staffers here said she has student loans, she graduated, and her planner said to her, you know what, the best thing you can do is open a retirement account today, particularly if the employer that you're working for offers a match, because that's free money that they're giving you. And even if you're only putting in $25 a month, the most important thing is to flex that saving muscle and get into the habit. So you want to balance your student loan repayments with all of your other financial priorities.
That's a great point that you bring up, Carrie, and I'm glad that you mentioned the income-based student loan repayment. I know that a lot of borrowers either don't know about that or they simply don't know how to take advantage of it. And I know personally for myself, it's a great resource being able to be on the income-based repayments right out of graduate school and having to repay those loans. So I'm glad that you brought that up for students and borrowers to take advantage of that and know that that's an option as well. So the next question I have, and this comes directly also from one of our followers on Twitter, and Betsy, I'm going to pose this question to you because this is something you and I have talked about in the past. Our Twitter follower asks about special student loan forgiveness programs for higher ed professionals or those who worked in TRIO programs at colleges. And so can you speak a little bit to what type of loan forgiveness programs are available, not for higher ed professionals, but also just some other forgiveness options that students might not be aware of?
Sure. Well, I think the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, which is offered by the federal government for federal student loans, I think is the one that's the most well known. And I also think that's the one that may apply best to your particular Twitter follower. That applies to anybody who works for a state, federal, local government, or for any 501c3, which is a nonprofit organization. And because most colleges and universities are not-for-profit, I think that might be the first thing that this Twitter follower should look into. You have to work in the industry, not necessarily the same one, for 10 years and make 10 years worth of payments, and anything that's left over at the end is forgiven. But this, we actually did a search just for fun of all the student loan forgiveness programs that we could find, and we found over 60. So you can find a list of them on our website. So shameless plug, saltmoney.org. It's called 60 Ways to Get Out of Paying Your to not pay your student loans without paying them. But some other programs that are in that list that might apply to your particular Twitter follower is there's actually in Illinois, New York, and Rhode Island, they're actually looking specifically for faculty members to teach nurses and other health professions. So if this follower happens to be a faculty member in that particular genre, those programs may also apply to them. There's also another federal program called the Faculty Loan Repayment Program that, again, is repaying up to $40,000 in student loans for people who are faculty members in nursing and other medical schools. But there's forgiveness programs for veterinarians who work in Kentucky that specialize in large food animals. I think that's my favorite one. So, you know, also borrowers should look to their employers. It's becoming a much more popular benefit for employers to offer student loan repayment reimbursement or student loan forgiveness if you work at an organization for a certain amount of time. So, so keep looking.
Absolutely, and that Kentucky program is one that I'm a big fan of, and we've done some at US News, have written a couple of different articles about loan forgiveness programs and point to that 60+ ways to get rid of student loans without repaying it. So it's definitely there. I was surprised by some of the options available for students as well. It's encouraging to me as a borrower to know that that might be, you know, there might be ways to have that debt reduced a little bit. We actually have a question here from one of our viewers, and so we have Amelia's asking, and I think this one might be a good one for you to tackle here, Carrie, is what do you recommend as a savings cushion at a young age, which can be difficult to do when you're trying to save, you're maybe not making as much as you hope to be making 10 years down the road, and you still have these student loans to pay off.
Yep, Amelia, what I'm going to tell you is that what financial planners recommend is 6 months of living expenses in the bank. Now, in the same breath, I'm going to tell you that most average Americans don't have that. It's particularly hard to get started. What we know from studies about personal finance and psychological behavior of humans in general is that if you start saving, there's something called the status quo bias. We keep doing what we've always done. So when you get your first paycheck, you want to actually allocate that toward all of your financial goals. So a little bit should go into a savings account for a rainy day or for all the reasons that you might need to draw on emergency savings. The minimum should be going to pay down your highest interest rate on your student loan balance. But even before that, if you have credit card debt, you also want to look at paying off the highest interest rate credit card debt. But 6 months is the recommendation, unless, say, you're in a freelance field or a really volatile career field, and then they recommend 9 months.
Great, thank you for addressing that, Carrie. I don't know if Betsy or if Kathy, if either of you have anything to add to that.
I think that's good advice. You know, it's about creating habits, and we find that, you know, to be successful in paying your debts and that includes paying the debt to yourself in the form of a savings account. It's about creating the habit of making those payments.
Okay, great. Well, thank you guys for answering that question, and Amelia, I hope that was helpful for you. And I do want to remind anyone who is tuning in today, if you do have questions, please don't don't hesitate to ask. That's why we're here and why we're doing this. But we do have another question that came from Sean Netzel via our Facebook account earlier this week. And John says, I have 3 separate loans. He said they're all from the Department of Education, and they're with the same interest rates. And he asks, should I focus on paying each one separately or one by one, or should I pay a little bit on all of them all together? And I think this is something that can be confusing for borrowers. You're borrowing from the same place, but you can have, as many as 4 loans in a given year, depending on, how your semesters worked at school. So how should Sean manage repaying those loans? Kathy, I'd like to kind of start this one with you, if you can weigh in on that, and how he should be doing that with these federal loans.
Sure. In general, these 3 loans that he mentioned usually would be under the same servicing company. So they may appear to be separate loans because that's how they were originally given to him. But in actuality, it's sort of a combined grouping at this point once the borrower goes into repayment. So he's paying, let's say, $150 to a servicing company, but that's being allocated out to each and every loan proportionately. And that's the way it will always go whenever he makes his payment to his servicing company. Can he pay extra every month? Absolutely. Do we always encourage extra payment every month? If you can certainly afford to do so, it's always in your best interest to overpay or prepay a federal loan. Definitely worthwhile to set up auto draft, which is what I recommend. The only way to pay a student loan debt is auto draft at the servicing company's website. And you can certainly always overpay the minimum installment that's expected of you. By doing so, that extra amount of money, even if it's only $50 a month, that money is going to be allocated to the principal after the interest and principal for the minimum installment that month is met. So if you were being billed for $100 in an example, and you decided you could afford to pay $150, the extra $50 would be allocated to principal on one of the loans that month. And it's certainly well in his best interest to pay down principal as much and as quickly as possible, because that will reduce the amount of interest in the long run that it would cost the borrower.
All right, well, thank you very much for answering that question. And I know that can be confusing. So even though Sean has 3 different loans with the Department of Education, when he makes that payment through his loan servicer, then it's all going towards those 3 loans. It's not being split up between each of them. You know, he doesn't really have a choice between paying one and then not the other.
Correct.
Okay, and we actually have, and we're getting close to kind of our end time here, but we do have another question from someone who's tuning in today. And this one, so we've got Connor, and Connor's asking, what's the appropriate balance between investing in long-term savings and paying off student debt? So I don't know, Carrie, this one might be a good one for you to tackle when you're kind of looking at savings and paying off debt.
I would say there's no magic formula. It depends on your finances, what your big picture is, what salary you're earning, how many student loans you have, whether you have credit card debt, all the things that we've touched on. But the first thing that you want to do is start building up that emergency cushion. And that goes for anybody. And that's why it's a good rule of thumb to say 6 months, because it's easy to wrap your head around. So you want to be doing both at the same time. You want to be allocating money towards savings. At the same time, you want to be putting at least the minimum toward your payments on your student loans. And again, if you do have credit card debt, also making at least the minimum payments on those. But what our financial planners would recommend is that you actually prioritize the credit card debt over the student loans, and then you balance the personal savings and the debt repayment that you have. If you want to see what this looks like in real life, I think sometimes it can be helpful to get some inspiration, because it seems like you're alone with this debt hanging over your head. We have a lot of stories on LearnVest, like one woman who paid off $90,000 of debt in 3 years. There's a whole Paying Off Student Loans 101. And one of my favorite stories that I think is really grounding for what the most common questions that we get are this or that questions. Should I put the extra $200 I have at the end of the month toward my debt, toward my credit cards, into retirement, into a savings account, into the stock market? What do I do? So there's the 50-20-30 rule, which is how to budget for anything. And it basically helps you take whatever you have coming in that month and figure out how to allocate it. And that's free on learnvest.com.
Great, thank you, Carrie. I think that's really helpful, and that can be difficult, kind of trying to figure out how to balance, you know, my credit card payment that's due. Do I pay the full thing off and not pay as much towards my student loan, or exactly how to do that? So hopefully, Connor, hopefully that answered your question. So we are running low on time. I want to really encourage anyone who's still out there watching to ask any questions if you have them, while we've got these 3 wonderful, really intelligent women on the line here. But I do also have just one last question that I'm going to pose to all 3 of you, because you all kind of see this from different sides of the coin. What is the biggest mistake that you see students make, or that a student can make, when it comes to their student loan repayment? And Betsy, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll just work our way down the line. I would really love to hear from each of you on this.
The biggest mistake that I see existing borrowers make with their student loan repayment is not understanding what payment plan they're on. We made a lot of comments about paying, at least pay the minimum on your student loans. Well, be careful, because with student loans, sometimes the minimum isn't even covering interest only. And sometimes these payment plans are so long, 10, 15, even 30 years, that people kind of forget that maybe they were having a tough time year 1 and 2, and then they can't figure out 10 years down the road or 5 years down the road why their principal balance is the same as where it started. So it's always a good idea to take a pulse check on your student loan and your other financed accounts at least every once a year, and check out the payment plan you're on and see if you can make any adjustments.
That's great. And Carrie, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you see from your readers and from people that they can make when they're trying to repay their student loans?
I think the biggest thing that we see is people call us all the time and say, I must be the worst financial case that you've ever seen. And everybody says that. But what we know from the stats are that 1/3 of student loan borrowers are in default. So I would say the biggest mistake that you can make is the ostrich and the putting your head in the sand and not looking at what you owe. It has crazy serious consequences if you don't pay your student loans. They don't dissolve if you declare bankruptcy. It can hurt your credit score. The immediate sum of your loans is going to become due if you default on them. So do look at them and then figure out what the best payment plan is for you. I think Kathy's advice was great.
Great. And Kathy, we'll end with you. What's the biggest mistake students can make when it comes to student loan repayment?
Number one, I agree with definitely everything that's been said thus far. For me, it's mostly, first of all, taking ownership of the debt. First of all, knowing what you borrowed. I see graduate students here at our university, and they're not sure what they borrowed from their prior universities before they got here. So one of the first things I teach our borrowers when they're graduating is to get onto the national database, nsLDS.ed.gov, and look up and see what you have. And I think we've already sort of tuned into that. Figure out what you owe and to whom you owe. It used to be very confusing. People used to owe many different servicing companies. That has been extremely streamlined now. Thank you, U.S. Government, Department of Ed, finally, so that there's less servicers assigned to each borrower as we go forward. But if you are a really old borrower, you've got possibility of 3 to 4 servicing companies. I had a call just yesterday with that scenario. So knowing where your debt is, knowing how much you've borrowed, what kind of debt it is, and what are your opportunities to either consolidate, stretch the debt, manage the payment. Sticking the head in the sand, not a good thing. It's going to come back and haunt you. You will want to buy a house someday, get a mortgage, have a car payment, or finance a car, an automobile, or other major purchase, and it will come back to haunt you. In addition, if you want to go on to graduate school and you have defaulted on student loans, you will not be able to get financial aid again in the future. You will absolutely be shut down because of that defaulted status. So it does come back to haunt. Don't ignore it. Face it. Make some calls. Ask for help.
Great, and that's really good advice from all three of you. And Kathy, I'm glad that you mentioned the National Student Loan Database. I know the first time that I pulled my own up and looked, it was eye-opening to see exactly how many are there, and it's easy to lose track of those when you're 18, 19, 20 years old and signing these student loan forms. So I'm really glad that you mentioned that, and I thank you to all three of you for joining our panel, and thank you for everyone who's tuning in or anyone who watches this after the fact. If you do have more questions about student loans, please do stop by the U.S. News Education website and check out our Paying for College content. We've got some great advice on student loan consolidation, student loan forgiveness, and some really good tips on just paying back your student loans. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter, U.S. News Education on both of those, and keep up with some of the latest content that we're putting out about student loan repayment. So Betsy, Kathy, Carrie, thank you again for joining us today, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.